wanted to talk a bit about what it is like to be transgender, particularly in the Jewish world. And that's a subject that I started talking about when I returned to Yeshiva University, where I'd gotten tenure as a man. I returned as myself, and the New York Post thought that that was hysterical. They had never heard of anything so funny, and they put it under the headline Yeshiva, and I was on page 3. I wasn't on page 1 because I think some New York politician had had sex with the wrong people and they had photos, so but that was really what put me on the map in 2008. So for a long time, if you Googled transgender and Jewish, I was pretty much the only thing that came up. There were other transgender Jews, but there wasn't anybody who'd really risen to that kind of consciousness. I wasn't at Yeshiva University because I was Orthodox. I was there just really because I needed a job. I was Jewish and religious, but not in an Orthodox way.
You were teaching there?
I was, yeah. I'm an English professor. So at Yeshiva University, it's an Orthodox Jewish university, which means that the most important part of the university is the men's college, and that's where the rabbis are. And for a long time there wasn't a women's college, and then 2 members of the board were walking through Midtown Manhattan. They saw an empty building, and one said to the other, maybe we should buy that building and make a women's college. And the other said, okay. So that's the college that I teach at, is the women's college. And of all of the departments at Yeshiva University, the one that is considered the strangest, the most secular, the one that has the least to do with Orthodox Judaism is the English department. So I was already kind of on the outer fringes of Yeshiva University's culture. And that made it easier for them. I don't think it was easy for them to accept having an openly transgender professor, but because I was kind of in the Siberia of the university anyway, that was tolerable. Apparently it was better than a lawsuit. They did place me on what they called involuntary research leave. So they didn't fire me, but they said that I couldn't set foot on campus. And I know a lot of professors who wish their universities would say, we'll keep paying you, but you just can't set foot on campus. They'd be like, oh, sign me up for that. But it turns out that it feels pretty lousy to be discriminated against. Because I'd been living as this middle-class white guy, I hadn't had a lot of anti-Semitism. Certainly, I'm teaching at Yeshiva University. I would say one problem you will not have is anti-Semitism. I never really experienced discrimination before. I'd always felt different. I'd felt marginalized, and I always assumed that people would hate me if they knew that I was transgender. But since they didn't, I didn't know what it felt like to be discriminated against, and it felt awful. So I started trying to go back, and I thought, this is insane, because the only reason that I went into teaching was I was a writer. Actually, I was a poet, which meant that I was a writer who would never, ever earn money from writing. And teaching was the only job I knew where they would pay you for long stretches of time not to work. So here, I now have the ultimate writer's teaching job, where they pay you all year long to never, ever work for them. And so part of me is like, you're insane, just take the money and go. But it turned out that it felt so awful to be looked at that way. And also, you know, I love teaching and I loved my students, and they kept writing to me, and this really surprised me. So they're Orthodox Jewish students, and they started sending emails like, you know, I don't really understand what you are, but I think that it's awful that an institution representing Orthodox Judaism would treat a human being this way. And another said, my culture doesn't tell me anything about how to respond to people like you, but it tells me a lot about how to respond to people in pain. And I know you must have been in a lot of pain in order to do this. And all of this was astonishing to me, because as I was saying, I grew up feeling like I was just something completely different than every other human being, because I wasn't simply male or female. And I grew up assuming that everybody, including my parents, my family, people who said that they loved me, would in fact, despise me, would see me as a monster if they really knew who I was. I certainly believed that Orthodox Jews would respond that way. So I had this very dim view of the human race in general, like, yeah, they could never handle somebody like me. But I had a particularly dim view of Orthodox Jews because I just assumed that that kind of rejection of people who didn't fit in what they call the gender binary, the idea that people are either a male or female and that's it, that's really built into the culture, it's built into the religion, and so I figured, of all the human race, those people would find it hardest to deal with me. When my students started writing to me, I realized that I had sold both humanity and Orthodox Judaism short, that Orthodox Judaism does have those kinds of values that say, we can't really allow for people who are too different, that's going to threaten everything, but it has another value which many Orthodox Jews feel is more important, which is the value that everybody is created in God's image. And so the way you treat any human being is really the way that you're reflecting your relationship with God. So when that student said that she was ashamed that an institution representing Orthodox Judaism would do this, it was like, what planet are you from? I mean, of course, this is what Orthodox Jews have to do. But she saw it completely differently. She saw the Yeshiva University, as betraying this kind of core value by not treating me as a human being. And that really blew my mind slowly, because it was kind of giving me the message that I was a human being, which is not something that I grew up thinking. Because I grew up in a culture that couldn't imagine people like me, and the images of the people who were closest to people like me, like sitcoms are filled with men in dress jokes, even SpongeBob. I mean, wherever there's comedy, there's usually a joke about a man in a dress. So those were the only images of anybody who resembled me in any way, shape, or form. Somebody who was physically male but was presenting themselves as female, and it was always as someone who was ridiculous and should, So the idea that I could be who I really was, and be considered not only human but worthy of respect, this was mind-blowing for me. And in secular culture, frankly, by that point, the people that I hung out with, many people were uncomfortable with me, but everybody had the idea that they should pretend to be okay with me. And therefore, nobody said to me not nobody, but very few people said to me what my students were saying to me, which was, look, you're human, and we feel like we have to treat you with respect. There were people who accepted me, there were people who rejected me, but we just didn't talk about it because everybody was supposed to be cool with it one way or the other. So it was really my conservative students who were able to give me this this kind of message. That didn't mean that everything was sunshine and roses when I went back to teach. I had to sit down with the dean, the provost, and 3 or 4 lawyers in a room to talk about only one thing, was where I was going to use the bathroom. And the lawyers, they were delighted to talk about this. All of the lawyers were gay. Yes, the university had hired gay lawyers. I had gay lawyers, and the gay lawyers were like, right, because, you wanted to hire people who would, know what these kinds of issues were. So their gay lawyer was saying to my gay lawyers, that no court has ever upheld the right of transgender people to use the restaurant room they identify with in a place of employment. And my lawyers were saying, but that's wrong. And they're saying, okay, you want to go there, we'll go. And finally I said, look, I'm here, sitting here, and I have not actually been had an institution discuss my bathroom usage since I was in kindergarten. I don't think it has been an issue. Actually, probably your child has had those discussions about, you should use the toilet. Here's the toilet. Do you need, but so that was kind of awful. And it the fact that nobody, including the lawyers who were representing me, really understood how awful it was to be an adult, much less a tenured professor, and have all of these people talking about where I could use the bathroom, shows that while in some way I think there's a lot more awareness of transgender people and the challenges we face, infinitely more than there was when I was growing up as a child. In other ways, I think as a culture, we still haven't come to grips with this stuff. Because frankly, when I use the women's room, and call me a hypocrite, whatever it is, I identify as female. If I see somebody who looks like a guy, I'm upset. Right? I have some nerve. But nonetheless, when I go into a space which is supposed to be a same gender space, and I see somebody who doesn't look like they belong, I think I have a lot of the same emotional reactions that people who are not trans do. It's like, wait, what's going on here? Should I be afraid? When I hear footsteps behind me on the street at night and I'm alone, I look back to see if it's a man or a woman, and I don't say to myself, well, it doesn't matter what they look like. You can't really know whether somebody is male or female by looking at them. For all you know, they're transgender and they're, however, no. I'm just like, if it's a guy, I'm afraid. If it looks to me like somebody is a woman, I feel better. I don't go back and say, excuse me, could you tell me how you identify in terms of your gender? And that is one of the things that makes all of this confusing, is that as a species really, but certainly as an American culture and within the Jewish world, we're just beginning to think about, well, what does it mean to know that we don't know? That somebody's body or their way that they dress doesn't necessarily tell us whether they're male or female. So if you listen to transgender people, a lot of us try to make it sound simple. It's like, duh, it's all about how you identify. It's a completely personal thing. It's like, you don't expect to look at somebody and know if they're a Democrat or a Republican, right? Well, I mean, but really, you shouldn't. And it's the same thing with gender. You want to know how people identify in terms of gender, you should ask them, and everything else is this oppressive insistence on the gender binary. But that is not the way any culture has ever done gender. Gender isn't just about how people see ourselves, it's also about the way we see one another, right? So when I am walking alone on the street, I want to be able to know who's walking behind me in this way. Why? Because that can have real and life-threatening consequences. If you're studying employment opportunities or pay, you kind of need to know who's male or female, or you can't tell the degree to which there is discrimination against people for being female. And so we have now these two completely different ideas of what gender is. One which says it's completely a matter of self-identification, and that works pretty well for a fairly small number of people and is a little bit crazy for most people. And the other which says you can tell, well, you already know, right? When my kids were born, I didn't say, I wonder if they'll grow up transgender. Actually, I was afraid they might, because for me it was a pretty awful experience growing up. But I never hesitated to think of my son as my son and my daughters as my daughter. And so it came as kind of a shock to me when my 13-year-old daughter said, actually, I'm trans, please start referring to me as he. And I'm still not used to that. Everything, I've spent 13 years thinking of this child in one way, and I liked it. I liked knowing my child as my daughter and all of the ways that I was relating and the things that we would watch things together, and I would think, oh, we're going to share the critique of how female characters are portrayed, right? All of this stuff is, even for me, is kind of thrown into confusion, and that's one of the reasons that binary gender is so important to us. Is number one, it helps us figure out who we are, and that's the same for me. If there was no gender binary, I wouldn't have had any word for how I identify, and I wouldn't have known how to get dressed to come here, and right, I have a female gender expression and a female gender identification. But the other is that it's the basis for most of our relationships, even relationships that should have nothing to do with gender. There are infinite numbers of studies of the workplace, for example, that say workplace relationships are different, whether, for men and for women, and between women and men and men, right? So whether we like it or not, whether we think it's a good thing or not, and for women in a lot of situations it's not a good thing, binary gender is so crucial for how we relate to one another and how we understand ourselves, that it's not a simple thing to say, you know what, you're right, I respect transgender people, so let's just change the system of gender and we will stop knowing how people identify until we ask them. There's a further complication, which is I've always been the kind of transgender which is transsexual. In fact, I am the most I'm like the common housefly equivalent of transgender people. I'm the kind that is you see everywhere, and if you've heard about any transgender people, it's my kind, which is technically male to female transsexual. So people who are born male but identify as female, and identify so strongly as female that we're willing to basically wreck our lives in order to live that gender identification. That was more or less the official definition. They've now changed the manual to the DSM, the Manual of Psychological Diagnoses, but for a long time, transsexual was one of the things in there. And if you looked it up, that's what it says. It said, if your client is not delusional or otherwise crazy, has this sense of identity that doesn't fit their bodies, and is willing to wreck their entire lives in order to express it, you're dealing with a transsexual. In other words, it was hard to separate the oppression that people like me experience from who we are. And within the trans world, there is an often bitter debates between transsexuals who see ourselves as, we've suffered for our true selves, and other kinds of transgender people who often have a lot less fraught life and death relationships to their gender identity. In fact, I live in a semi-rural area, so there weren't a lot of trans people. The only support groups that there were when I was in the worst part of this, where I was like, I was going to kill myself, my family was falling apart. So I looked for groups, and the only groups were these groups of male cross-dressers. And so these are guys they're a different kind of transgender people. They have kind of second female selves. I do not understand this. If you're thinking, like, what the heck does that mean? I don't know. You're going to have to invite a male cross-dresser to tell you about that one. But I walk in there, and I'm like, I'm in the verge of suicide, blah, blah, and I walk into the room filled with the happiest people I've ever seen in my life. Because they're all like guys, they're married, their wives know that they're cross-dressers. Once a month or so, they live this other kind of self, and that's good for them. The other part of their lives is good for them too. There's no tension. And they looked at me like I was a space alien. And I'm like, what is wrong with you? Why don't you want to die? And blah, blah, blah. And they're like, no. So your question is the first question. Transgender is an umbrella term, as I was explaining before. Sorry for the repetition. It was invented for political reasons, because there are a lot of kinds of people who have relations to gender that are more complicated than male or female. Some of those people are intersex, which is to say their bodies don't meet the biological definitions of male or female. That's really kind of a separate group, and intersex people don't like to be. Transgender people love to identify with intersex people because it enables us to say, see, human beings are not only created male or female, look at their bodies. Because people, when I was growing up for most of my life, and still today, some people look at my body and they say, what is wrong with you? Your body clearly defines you as male. So I point to intersex people and say, see, it's possible. And intersex people are like, we have our own problems. Could you please leave us out of your little transgender family there? So, but they're like male cross-dressers. They're people who are gender fluid, which is to say that they identify as themselves, and they sometimes express who they are by presenting as male, sometimes as female, which is to say they don't see their gender expression as being an expression of their essence, of some kind of essential gender identity. There are people who are gender queer, which I don't even know if there's an official definition of this, but in general means that they give mixed gender signals. They don't want to be identified as male or female. Even the way gender fluid people are, they're okay if they present as male, they want you to treat them as male. But gender queer people, they're like, we are outside the binary, and so they will present in ways that make it very hard to pin them down as one or the other. And there are people who deliberately present in ways that screw gender up. It's like the gender equivalent of the sound of one hand clapping. So you have a bushy beard and you always wear cocktail dresses or something, and you know that people are going to be like, ah, what's going on there, right? If that had been me, Yeshiva University would not have let me come back. I am quite sure about that. But a lot of people who are like me, who are transsexual, so that's physically we are one sex. However, we identify with the other side of the gender binary. So that's much simpler than those other kinds of people. And when I go to college campuses, I have to apologize because it's like a dinosaur coming back to talk to mammals. They're like, yes, you've probably heard of old-fashioned, simple people like me. I know it's not cool. I actually had one college student, I'd been living as myself for 5 years, say, I just want you to know I really respect people of your generation who, believe that there was such a thing as binary gender, and I could feel like the glass museum case closing in around me and the label being stuck. Yes, talk to the 20th century transsexual before we disappear. So transgender, when I was starting to, when my book was going to come out and I was going to start talking about this, one of the organizations, I won't say who, that works to promote understanding, actually understanding is not what, works to promote acceptance of lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and queer people. They came to me and they said, look, lovely that you going out there and talking about this, but please stop using the word transsexual. And I was like, wait, that's my word. When I was growing up, and I thought I was the only one of my kind, and I came across an article that, it was actually in Red Book or something like that, one of the magazines, it could have been called the official magazine of the gender binary, but it was a mother talking about her child who had been born male and was now her daughter, and that was the first I had heard that I wasn't the only one of my kind. And that was the word, transsexual. And I liked long words. I was 9. I thought if I was something that needed a long word, I must be smart. And yeah, it's I had a lot to learn. And that was the only word, really, that was generally known for people who were not male or female. So it wasn't really just Red Book. So I hung on to that word for dear life. And when I came out to people, that was the word I used. And it is still the most accurate word, because the word transgender is so general that it's like if somebody says, are you male or female? You say, well, I'm human. Can you tell me about yourself? Well, I'm a human being. I've always been human. So I've always been transgender. It doesn't tell you anything. When I say I'm transsexual, it tells you a lot of things about my history and relation to gender. But one of the reasons that I was told, one of the bad things about it is it has the word sexual in it. Yes, and of course it's, number one, you do not get more sex if you're transsexual, so it's inaccurate in that sense. But the word sexual is in transsexual because it's a medical term. So it's sexual in the medical sense, and it was developed because people kept coming to doctors and saying these weird things. Like men would come and say, Doc, I can't live in this body anymore, this body is wrong, I can't tolerate it, please help me. Or the opposite, and doctors were like, we're not actually allowed to operate on people or treat people who don't have an illness. And I don't think that's a bad thing. because that would be like medical experimentation. Well, you know, you have a perfectly healthy male body, but let me cut you up and rearrange you a little. We don't want those kinds of doctors. But nonetheless, there were doctors who saw that human beings were suffering and they wanted to do something, so they had to invent a medical category for it. Otherwise, this is even before insurance. Once there's insurance, then you also need it, although insurance still doesn't cover a lot of stuff related to being transsexual. So it's a medical term that doctors use to explain to other doctors that they weren't butchering healthy patients. And so it didn't have anything to do with sex. Being gay and lesbian, that does have to do with sex. But obviously nobody thought it was, everybody wanted to move away from homosexual for the same reason, because it's, for Americans, maybe it's different in France. I think sex is maybe a selling point in France. Having an identity with sex in it is better. But in the United States, it is better not to identify yourself using the word sexual. Otherwise, people stigmatize you. So they came to me and they said, look, please don't use that word. We're trying to get everybody to move to this word transgender. And I was pretty upset. I was like, you're supposed to be on my side, helping create a world where I can be who I am, but you're saying I can't use the word that represents my own identity. It's like and who decides these things? Like if somebody went around and said to every Jew, we're not calling ourselves Jews anymore. If you go back into, like I did some research in old newspapers at the turn of the century, a lot of Jews referred to themselves as Israelites. And at some point, that went out of fashion. And there must have been some people who were upset about it, like me. They're like, well, wait a second, I grew up as an Israelite, I identify, I read the Torah, and they're referred to as Israelites. The word Jew is nowhere in the Torah. Why do we have to start calling ourselves Jews? And I actually don't know why that happened, but, it was a successful campaign. So I said, all right, I'm going to do this, but I found that if I only used the word transgender, then I wasn't promoting understanding, because I was pretending to represent more kinds of people than I actually was. In fact, I think maybe we're going to move to a relation to gender that's more like my students' relation to being Jews, which is we see it as a story that we tell about shifting identifications and not as some essence that we have to be from the moment we're born to the day that we die. So, strangely enough, I've learned a lot about being transgender from Orthodox Jews. Thank you very much.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jem, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.